Hello, welcome to this extremely definitely a procrastination video. As usual, there will be links in the description box of resources and places to donate. Also, I think maybe next week I'll be reading the 5th chapter of Are Prisons Obsolete, depending on how much energy I have, because yeah, I'm now coming up to like a month and a bit until my dissertation is due, so I'm not sure if I'll have energy, but like at some point. So today, I haven't really made notes, but I'm going to talk about the books that I'm writing my dissertation on, or at least I'm definitely going to talk about 2 of the books that I'm writing my dissertation on, and I might talk about the 3rd one, but just depending on whether I want to or not. Depending on the vibe, basically. You can tell this is some like niche, underrated, underknown Victorian shit, because they're both in these like, just sort of like scholar editions, but not even really scholarly. But yeah, so the first one is On the Threshold by Isabella Ford, and the second one is The Girl from the Farm by Gertrude Dix, which I read the most recently. Actually no, I guess I reread this the most recently, but I've read this the most recently. Both of the books are from 1895. I really have no idea where I'm going with this video. I just kind of felt like I tried to film a video and I didn't like it at all, and then I was like, well, I maybe should just talk about the books that I'm thinking about a lot, and so then I thought that would be nice, and hopefully it will be interesting, especially interesting maybe to people who are interested in the Victorians. But maybe we should start with why I was drawn to these writers slash books, and I guess the main reason, well, okay, there are multiple reasons, but first of all, I only care about women writers, so obviously they had to be women. Second of all, I am kind of working within the confines of my degree, which has a particular time frame that I have to be focusing on, and 1895 is actually outside of that time zone, but the main novel that I'm writing my dissertation on was published just in that time frame. So that sort of also narrowed down what I can choose, but also, yeah, you can't really understand the present without looking at the past. One of the major things that drew me to these books and to these authors was that I'm interested in history not as a static, conservative backwater of boring, terrible, oppressive ideas, and not one that had a lot of nuance and energy and was constantly fighting against oppressed and being oppressive. You know, there were people who fought against the things that were like, oh well, it was the past, so they believed these horrible things. There were people who fought against all of those things at all of those times, because people are not, you know, a monolith. There's never been a time when everybody agrees on everything, and it frustrates me when people represent the past like that, because I think also like it defangs the political history that we know and the way that we can build on the movements that came before to create the future and the world that we want to exist in. Because a lot of, you know, world building and discussion around what a better world would look like, what an anti-capitalist world would look like, was discussed and explored, particularly in the 1880s and 1890s in Victorian literature, which is where my project comes out of, although it's not actually totally focused on that time frame. These books, but I would definitely say On the Threshold probably the most, is a really kind of like a useful sum up of, there's like a word where you like cut into a cake or something and you get to see like a bisection of, is that really the word? I'm not sure. Of the kind of utopian, anti-capitalist, socialist feeling of the British Victorian left from the 1880s onwards. This is actually set in the 1880s, even though it came out in 1895, and it softly parodies those kind of like utopian hopes that were encouraged and excitedly discussed in the late 1880s to the 1890s. Unlike the other book in my dissertation, neither of these, I mean, these are deeply flawed novels. All of the novels I'm looking at just like absolutely deeply flawed, and some of them are so clumsy. I think, at least personally, like it's hard not to have a kind of tenderness for these women, because they were part of these like new women writers, which is a particular phenomenon. There's a book called The New Woman by Sally Ledger, which talks a bit about this phenomenon as well, which is probably useful if you're interested in the concept. The concept was kind of first like discursively formalised in the 1890s. I think in 1894, one of the academics that I've read sort of pinpoints, but then it had this long-lasting effect on women authors, but also the representation of women textually for you know, years afterwards. And you know, people kind of talk about Virginia Woolf, for example, being like the 2nd generation new woman writer, and other modernists as well. And the New Woman is definitely part of the move towards what we see now as modernism. I hope this makes sense. Like, I've done so much reading, I'm just kind of like, blah. But anyway, all that being said, like, I think because of this newness to the New Woman, this like naivety, this freshness, this sense of the world could be different and I want it to be different and I'm going to try and make it different, it's quite hard to feel like angry with how much they sort of fail in lots of ways. And I guess with this one, because it is a satire, I think maybe Isabella Ford has some awareness of that as well. So Gertrude Dix's other book is the one that I'm focusing my dissertation on, and that's called The Image Breakers, and I think I did talk a bit about it on this channel before. But yeah, so I read this more recently, and yeah, it surprised me with how much I liked it in the end. You know, I closed the book and I put it away, and then when I was thinking back on it, I was like, actually, I think it's quite sweet. I think there are lots of failings, especially in the representation of this working class woman who's the girl from the farm, who I don't even think is named in the text, which is actually very upsetting if you think about it, because the main character is not the girl from the farm. The main character is this girl called Catherine, who is the kind of like typical New Woman, I guess, and she's like educated and has just come back from Cambridge or whatever, Newnham College, which is fairly recently founded, I think, and is back with her family, and her family, like her dad's a dean and stuff, and blah blah blah. It's all sort of mundane, but it's also about, you know, what shape you want your life to be and what you believe is important to focus your energies and self on. I guess one thing that is important to sort of talk about in relation to these novels is, and especially with Isabella Ford, both these women were socialists to lesser and greater degrees, and to, yeah, lesser and greater efficiencies, and that definitely affects the worlds that they create with their writing and the things that they explore. It's definitely like very much about socialism, and I think one of the key aspects of it, alongside the parody, is a maybe more genuine questioning of how middle-class women and working-class women can work together to make socialism happen, and whether we can reach each other and be in genuine mutual solidarity with each other. And I mean, I think Isabella Ford in this novel is pretty ambivalent about that capacity, and again, like, her representation of working class people, especially working class women, especially this one working class woman, leaves a lot to be desired, I think, in kind of granting the character real agency, a real sense of selfhood, which I think is very obvious in the two main characters, Lucretia and Kitty. I haven't really given you a synopsis of this. So basically, like I said, this is set in the 1880s, and it follows two art students, or like one is a music student, one is an art student, who've just gone to London to go to art school, and they're two young middle-class women, and you know, so they've just sort of escaped the clutches of the family home and are extremely grateful for that. And it's about their lives together. They kind of strike up a friendship, but it's always a bit of a tempered friendship between them and the maid at the place where they lodge. And they believe in socialism, they're like very fervent in their socialist faith, but it's also about how their faith isn't necessarily put into practice. And it's also, I think, quite a lot about socialist men being bad. And there is like a very New Womanish focus in the end in terms of thinking about marriage, which is definitely, I would definitely link this more with The Image Breakers by Gertrude Dix in that respect. I think they are very different novels, but in some ways they overlap in trying to figure out if marriage could ever be comradely and not a trap. Yeah, this one is much less kind of focused on free love in a real sense. The working class character kind of almost gets like a free pass to behave in a particular way, which if it was one of the main characters wouldn't be allowed, basically. I would think this would probably be censored then. I think also I wanted to talk a little bit about this book because I feel like if you're interested in these women, I mean actually this book doesn't talk at all about Dix. This is called The Women in the Room, Labour's Forgotten History by Nan Sloan, and it does have a focus on the foundation of the Labour Party, but it gives you a good history as well of sort of the trade union movement, especially with a focus on like women's union activity or inactivity depending, and so it kind of goes from the 1860s onwards. So it's very useful and it's also very sort of easy to read. So I definitely would recommend it. One of the things that it's very good at doing is demonstrating that radical political women weren't just involved in the suffrage campaign, and a lot of women who were on the left viewed the campaign as one that focused on like this limited suffrage, which only kind of recapitulated to like capitalist understandings of worthiness around who should get the vote and who shouldn't, and you know, most of that was reliant on like property ownership and also marriage, I guess. So some of these women were very much like antagonistic to or very frustrated with the suffragettes from the beginning of the 1900s. It's obviously very complicated, and so there's definitely some crossover and people switch sides a lot, and it was quite fluid in some places, and also like there were lots of different socialist organisations that came up from about the 1880s onwards, and people often like overlapped their memberships in some ways. But you can learn quite a lot about Isabella Ford from this book, because I think she was the first woman or something, like maybe the only, I can't quite remember anymore, but you know, she was one of the only women in the Labour Party sort of conferences before it became the Labour Party, and it was like the Independent Labour Party. So that kind of gives you more of a context for this novel. In terms of On the Threshold, again, something that I think this captures quite well is this sense of utopian socialism that is happening, where people are getting together and feeling like they want more than just sort of practical comradeship, they want spiritual comradeship with each other. And it is quite a middle class thing, and it kind of reshifts socialism to be about a lifestyle choice in a way. But there's a group that kind of debate whether they should form like a communistic household, and there's a discussion about the role of women within that household and the unequal division of gendered labour, which I think is really interesting, and is definitely what I'm writing about. But there's also within that a kind of parody of one of the groups at the time that came up in the 1880s that was called the Fellowship of the New Life. They were founded by some man. There was a bunch of them, basically. A key people that we remember was Edward Carpenter, because he wrote about homosexuality, and he was gay, and he lived with his gay lover in one of the sort of socialistic communes that he created. And there were lots of different settlements that were coming up in the 1880s to 1890s. A lot of them kind of failed, but some of them were based on like Tolstoy and his beliefs. I lost what I was saying again because I just kept rambling on. And Isabella Ford was a member of the Fellowship of the New Life. Further than that, the fellowship kind of spawned the Fabian Society, because people in the fellowship had a meeting and they were like, well, we think that we need to focus more on the material side versus the spiritual side, but there was this kind of rift, and so out of that rift came the Fabian Society. The Fabian Society were full of eugenicists. I mean, a lot of this socialism is quite eugenicist in nature, and that's very uncomfortable and upsetting. Yeah, especially in the context of the way that a lot of these socialists just believe in the value and importance of work in a way that, like, I personally find really alienating and very frustrating, because I actually don't think it's liberatory in any real sense. Yeah, no, so then you get the Fabian Society, and that's much more material and does a lot of like socially investigative stuff, but it's kind of questionable as to whether it's a socialist party, because it just wanted to like politically lobby the Liberal Party, and was also full of like middle class people who weren't particularly interested in actually dismantling the class system, really. Whatever, I'm sure lots of people will have different opinions, but yeah. I think it is interesting to read On the Threshold, which kind of talks about the situation in the 1880s and 1890s, and the way that people are trying to think of the future and trying to make it happen or not. And then also to read News from Nowhere by William Morris, which is about a traveller who wakes up. It was published in 1890 to 1891, and this traveller, he wakes up and it's the year 2000, and he goes to talk with this guy and he discovers how they got there, and it's this anti-capitalist sort of anarcho-socialist kind of world. There's a lot of issues with it, especially for me around the representation of women and the work that women still do and are still sort of like naturalised into doing. But it's also kind of interesting to think about the way that the ideas that are discussed in here and here all were impacting the political landscape at the time in the 1880s and 1890s. And also how that like energy was just sort of lost in the 1900s onwards. I mean, there's this really great chapter, which I can actually share if you're interested, that talks about the kind of the way that the sort of public and written political battles went from being about socialism and free love together, which is sort of this particular movement which was against marriage, but it further enforced heterosexuality because it didn't see that as an unnatural creation. It saw that as like the natural rule of nature, but that marriage and other kind of laws that enforce relationships like distorted natural human behaviour, I guess. And so some people were sort of free lovers. What the essay that I started talking about, what that chapter talks about, is the loss of the radical class critique, as there was more of a focus on free love, which meant that instead of the formulation, the regulation of people's relationships to each other as well as their relationships to property, which enabled there to be a class critique within being a free lover. Lots of free lovers were like, if you own property you can't be free, you can't love freely, and that sort of like marriage and women's economic position meant that marriage was an economic deal, and so getting rid of that was also part of emancipating women from capitalist patriarchy. And maybe they wouldn't use those terms, but I'm just going to use those terms right now because it's easiest. But moving from that into the biopolitical, the sexualized body, as being the grounds for like a place for politics to happen and to dismantle, but that really lost the focus on class, and instead it became this quite like individualized and then ultimately modernist space. I hope that made sense. Just let me know if you want to read that chapter and hopefully it will make more sense. I mean, you might not find it that interesting, but I thought it was quite cool. Especially because I think a lot of the time we see modernism as a complete break from what happened before, but actually, I mean, nothing really does happen like that, but modernism definitely didn't happen like that. I have no idea how long this video is going to be, but I think I'm going to stop there. I hope this was interesting. This is in part what I think about a lot at the moment, so like definitely let me know if you need me to try and explain what I was saying or if you're just interested in reading around this stuff. Yeah, I would be interested to know if anybody has read either of these. I feel like you probably haven't because they're quite hard to get. If you're interested in reading them, also let me know. But they are available, and also the Image Breakers is available online. I'm sure this is also available online. I mean, these all are all out of copyright, and these versions are just like printed from the first sort of editions of them, you know, they're not like modern editions, which I think is probably a shame. Might be a shame. Cool. I hope you're all doing well and are staying as safe as possible. Yes, I will see you when I next see you. If this video makes it to the internet, who knows?